This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nizzahon, and it's Saturday, and that means it's time for another edition of Nizzanotes, the weekly vlog series I do where I talk about limited magic. Right now we're still, in the tail end of Crimson Vow limited season. Kamigawa Neon Dynasty is really not very far away. We're still playing Crimson Vow. And just like last week where I didn't really talk about Crimson Vow in depth because I've done that a bunch already in this series, I'm going to talk about a broader limited topic here where I will use some examples from Crimson Vow to sort of tie things together. So in this video, I'm going to give you 10 tips that will help you succeed in any limited format. These are things that, for the most part, that I think if you do these will improve your win percentage in just about any limited format. There's a few qualifiers here and there that I'll talk about, but for the most part, I think these are tips that are useful for every format. At number 10, I have, don't overrate cards because they're good in Constructed. And so, all 10 of the things on this are things that I've seen people do, or things that I've found myself doing that I need to correct, that I think if you either stop doing or start doing will help improve, your limited play. And one of these is that it is somewhat easy to overrate cards in limited because they are good in Constructed. You're more familiar, especially if a card's like a reprint or something, and you're familiar with how powerful it is in Constructed, there is sort of an instinct to think, yeah, I really want to take this highly. A recent example of this from Midnight Hunt would be Delver of Secrets. Delver of Secrets is one of the greatest creatures in all of Magic, but that mostly applies to Constructed. The Delver did end up being kind of okay in limited, but it's nowhere near the powerhouse it is in Constructed, where you can easily make a deck that will flip it constantly and very easily, and you also have a critical mass of other 1-mana creatures who turn into very aggressive attackers without you having to do much. It's also easier to shove a bunch of spells into your deck in Constructed. So these are the kind of things that just won't work out as well in limited, and you have to sort of correct how good you think a card is when you open a pack or a sealed pool. You have to correct for the fact that a card like this not nearly as good in limited. A couple of examples of this that I've seen, people talk about or I've seen people do from Crimson Vow are Alchemist's Gambit. This card was printed at a time where extra turn effects were like dominating multiple formats in Magic, and this was a new one and it excited a lot of people. But its cleave mode is way too slow and way too expensive for Crimson Vow as a limited format, and its other mode is only good in incredibly narrow situations, so it's actually pretty much unplayable in limited. I've argued with people about this who say, it's good if you're in a situation where you need one more turn to kill your opponent. And it's like, well, yeah, obviously that's true, but you're not going to find yourself in that situation often enough for it to be worth it. Another example of this is Ascendant Pack Leader. It's certainly not unplayable in limited, but it's a very powerful 1-drop that is way better in Constructed, sort of like Delver of Secrets is, because you can build much more aggressive decks in Constructed where you just shove a bunch of 1-drops with 2 power into your deck, and you need a critical mass of those. And you can't do that in limited, there just aren't enough of them. So a card like Pack Leader, and pretty much every 1-mana 2/1 we ever see, isn't nearly as good in limited as it is in Constructed. And those are things to keep in mind. Just evaluate cards separately. Don't get excited about a card just because it's good in Constructed, because that may not mean it's good in limited. Now, sometimes it does. Lightning Bolt and things like that are good everywhere, but there are enough times where that's not true that you have to be careful. At number 9, I have only hate draft on rare occasions. I see people talk about and do hate drafting way, way more than they need to. If you don't know, hate drafting is the practice of taking a card out of a pack that you probably can't even play in your deck, but you take it because you're really worried about one of your people you're drafting with getting the card. And obviously on Magic Arena, where you don't play against your pod, you definitely shouldn't hate draft, because the chances of you actually playing against someone in your pod are minuscule. But even if you're playing in paper or on Magic Online, I guess Magic Online has leagues too, but even if you're playing against the same people in a pod, hate drafting does have, some diminishing returns. It's not that great. It depends. I didn't say never hate draft. There are definitely occurrences, especially when you're drafting with 7 other people, and those are the same people you're going to play with your deck. There are definitely occasions where a pack has, a mediocre card for your deck and nothing else. and it happens to have a bomb rare in another color. That's an occasion where, yeah, you should hate draft. The value you're going to get out of that is going to be superior to any value you might get out of picking up, a mediocre card. But the problem with hate drafting is that there's enough variance in Magic that you just don't have. You're doing something that may not actually have had an impact on you anyway. And what I mean by that is maybe when you play this person, they're not going to draw that card anyway, or maybe you never get matched up against them because you usually only play 3 matches in draft, and there's 8 people at the table, and that really decreases the expected value you can get out of hate drafting to the point where you really shouldn't be hate drafting if there is a solid or better card in the pack for you. If that's the case, don't hate draft. And I know this is, a lot of these videos have been far more contentious than I expected in this Nizzanotes series. And I know there will be people saying, hate drafting is really important, you need to do it. And, I just laid out why I don't think that's the case, and it's because the expected value of doing it isn't as high as picking up a card for your deck that you have more control over. The value you're going to get out of having a card in your deck is going to be higher than the value you get out of keeping your opponent from having a card in their deck. Again, sometimes hate drafting is the right thing to do. It has some value. It just doesn't have as much as taking a card that you are going to have in your own deck, that you're going to have control over, and that you're going to have more instances of chances to get that card. So, don't hate draft for the most part. That's especially true on Arena. But even in pod drafts, you really shouldn't be hate drafting a lot. And I know people do it a lot because I see arguments about it all the time, but you shouldn't be. Next up, I have listen to signals. So, what I mean here is that during the draft portion, if you are in a particular color, like you take 2 really powerful red cards with your first 2 picks, but then you see no other good red cards in that first pack. You really need to be paying attention to what's happening in this draft, and the signal you're getting is that red isn't open, at least to your right. And it sucks sometimes, in limited, starting off a draft with 2 really powerful cards in one color feels great, but you need to be ready to sort of, go through an escape hatch, get rid of those cards basically, and change what you're doing if you're not going to see enough red cards. Because if you have 2 really good red cards and that's it, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. And again, it sucks. It happens to everybody. It happens to all of us. But you need to be ready to consider going other routes in a draft. Don't get married to your picks, as people often say. Be ready to change at a moment's notice, although it's usually more than a moment because it's several picks. But you need to be ready to change after a few picks to a different plan if the initial plan just isn't panning out. And this is something, sometimes I find myself doing. This is something I could do a better job of doing, is you really get tunnel vision because you're really excited about certain cards you picked up, and then all of a sudden you look at your cards halfway through pack 2 and you're like, wow, I only have 2 good red cards, and that's not where you want to be. You need to figure it out sooner than that, and you usually can if the signals are clear enough and other people have all jumped into red too. You're going to have a way better deck if you find what color is open and draft that than you are if you keep trying to draft red. So remember to listen to signals when you're playing limited during the draft portion, obviously enough. Number 7, I have don't let a card's rarity affect your judgment. What I mean by this mostly is just because you see a card that is a mythic rare or a rare, do not assume that it's better than all the uncommons and commons in your pack, because oftentimes it isn't. And this is another thing that's easy to do. Rares and mythic rares are usually more complicated cards. They're usually, at least if you can get them going in a certain way, they do something cool. They're often powerful too if you can make them work. So there's a lot of reasons to go after rares and mythics. And, during Crimson Vow maybe isn't the best time to talk about this because there are so many rares and mythics that are better than all the commons and uncommons, but there's still some that aren't. And just, there are going to be packs where you have a mythic and the best card in your pack is a common. And an example of this would be like Cultivator Colossus. So this is a card. This is another card that in Constructed has some potential. I guess it kind of applies to the don't overrate cards if they're in Constructed, but I have it here because it's a mythic rare. It's this huge creature. It has a big text box, and that's all really exciting. But in Limited, it's really not that much better than a Colossal Dreadmaw. Sure, it is better for the most part, and sometimes you'll actually get to use its effect where you put a land into play and draw a card, and when you do that, it's going to be way better than the Dreadmaw, but In your typical game of limited, you're not going to have time to do that. You're just going to play this as a big creature. And the Colossus is absolutely playable, and it's a nice card, but I would take a bunch of commons over it. Bleed Dry, for example. Basically, all the really premium removal spells I would take over the Colossus. There are also many uncommons I would take over Cultivator Colossus. Some of them are removal, like Hero's Downfall. Others are just powerful cards, like the 3-mana 2/3 vampire that flips into a 3/3 and gives you red mana and all that. There's just a lot of cards in this set more powerful than the Colossus at lower rarities. And this is a card in particular that I've seen people really overrate. Either during my stream, they're like shocked I didn't take it over something that was better. Or I've seen people talk about this card as if it's great. And it is a nice card. I'm not saying it isn't, but just because it's mythic rare and seems cool doesn't mean, I'd say more often than not in a pack one, pick one, if you open up the Colossus is not what you need to be picking. And that's, maybe that sounds unusual, but that's just true of a card like this that is mostly just a big creature with trample. Also, this applies as well. You can't really think all uncommons are better than commons. These are all things you have to evaluate cards individually. And yeah, on average, uncommons are better than a lot of commons, but it's not always true. So, really, if you could just cover up the rarity on cards in a booster pack, I think it would actually help a lot of people, because people make picks sometimes that are influenced more by rarity, whether it's conscious or subconscious. And this is another thing that I think has affected me at times. It's hard not to let something like that affect you, but you'll do better if you can avoid really thinking about a card's rarity and just think about it, how good of a card it is on its own merits. All right, at number 6, I have don't religiously follow pick orders. I know people look at my set reviews, for example, and they look at the grades that cards get, and sometimes people will use those grades sort of in a vacuum to help them determine what to pick. I know there are other people out there, other creators who put out pick orders, like Frank Karsten, and various other content creators. There's other set reviews out there, and all of those things, all of that is useful stuff. But the thing I'm saying is, don't just look at grades, don't just look at a pick order and use that without really thinking about your individual situation. A pick order is useful, and as is a set review where you give things grades. These things are useful, especially, going into a new format. However, during a draft, your pick order should sort of fluctuate and go back and forth depending on what you need. If you pick up a bunch of removal early, all these cards that are also removal might not be as good for you to take as taking some 2-drops, some things that add to the board. And that's the opposite of that is true as well. If you're picking up a lot of really nice, powerful creatures early, efficient creatures, there comes a point where you have to start thinking about taking instead the removal over these creatures, because you're going to need the removal. And this also changes depending on what color pair you end up in, what synergy pieces you end up with. Doomed Dissenter is going to be a lot higher in your pick order in a blue-black deck than it is in like a black-white deck. So all of this fluctuates. So basically what I'm saying is don't pull up a spreadsheet or an image and be like, okay, Frank Karsten says this is, I should take this one card above this other card. And because you have to sort of be ready to change the pick order depending on how your draft is going. Starting point of a pick order or a set review or whatever is a great place to begin, but you have to be ready for that to change as your draft changes. On a similar note, at number 5, I have don't religiously follow bread. If you don't know what this is, you might actually be better off, because it's an acronym that stands for bombs, removal, evasion, aggro, and duds or dregs. Not everybody agrees on what the D stands for, but it basically stands for bad stuff. I think this is a great place to begin for new players, making sure people know you should probably be taking removal over most, regular creatures. Bombs is a more obvious thing, so that part of it isn't even that helpful, because a lot of things that are bombs are obviously bombs. You don't really need someone to tell you should take a powerful bomb over other things. But the removal part, I think, is one of the more useful things. I think sometimes people underrate it when they're new to a limited format or new to limited in general. And I think that part is pretty helpful. But from there, it kind of falls apart. For one thing, that this acronym is old, and Magic over the last few years in Limited has really changed. There used to be a time where Aggro, especially, was near the bottom of one of these lists. That's why it's the only thing above Duds. Um, but more and more we're getting good 1 and 2 and 3 drop creatures who are just very powerful, who are relevant all game long. And in this day and age, there are so many of these, so many traveling ministers, so many lantern commies around. Although I guess it also falls into evasion, but you know what I mean. These 1 drops are good, and we see these all the time now. So just sort of looking at bread is a bad idea. It also gets more complicated. Like everything, it basically doesn't have enough nuance. It's a good early learning tool, but once you've passed your early stages of learning about limited magic, you shouldn't be using this anymore because it's deceptive. Removal, this basically only means premium removal, right? It doesn't mean you should take every removal spell over all of these good evasive and aggressive creatures. It has to be premium removal. It has to be a card that does a lot for the mana cost, and or it does it without any questions asked. If you want to know more about premium removal, I actually did a Nizzanotes on that topic. But suffice it to say, there's a lot of mediocre removal out there that you should not be taking over good evasive or aggressive or both creatures. So yeah, bread isn't that useful anymore. We could come up with a new acronym, and I actually think Limited Resources came up with the rather funny new acronym a couple of months ago of keto that I think does a much better job of describing what you should sort of be pursuing when you're playing limited magic. And it's a better acronym that is more useful for more advanced players for helping them know what they should value. And if you're curious, what does keto stand for? The K is kill spells, E is efficient creatures, T is top end, so these are higher mana value things, that you play at the top, and O is other. This also isn't perfect, obviously, but if I'll put in the link to the YouTube video where they talked about this new acronym, that they're utilizing, and I think it's a lot better because they go through nuance for each of the letters. They talk about what they mean by kill spells and what they mean by efficient creatures, and so forth. But you can see within their list how much higher efficient creatures is than it would have been in the original bread. And I think that's one of the biggest changes in Magic that makes bread less relevant, because you have aggro is basically efficient creatures, and it's pretty low on the list, whereas it's the only thing, you have kill spells number 1 in keto. But yeah, check that video out if you want to know more about that acronym. I think it's a really useful one, far better than using bread. So my number four tip is to watch others draft and talk about the format. Obviously, you're watching this video, you're probably already doing it. You may be thinking that this sort of runs in opposition to number 6, which was don't follow pick orders or set reviews blindly, but it doesn't. I think, watching other people play and listening to other people talk about Magic and the format helps you learn, and you don't necessarily have to listen to what they're saying and treat it as gospel. But if you're pursuing and listening to a few different sources, you can sort of take what you agree with from each of these sources and come up with your own idea about the format overall. If you're a beginner, just sort of following what these people say is a good start. But once you become more advanced, you'll find yourself agreeing or disagreeing with various things that various Magic content creators talk about. And I think all of this is really useful for helping you think critically about the format yourself. So I definitely think you should watch others draft and talk about limited formats. My number 3 tip is to be aware of every common and uncommon instant in the format. Most of these don't involve a bunch of studying, right, so far. I guess there's a little bit of it here and there. But this one kind of does. In general, it's a very good idea to know when you sort of look over at your opponent how much mana they have up, what they might be able to do on your own turn to blow you out. Whether this is using, or on their turn too. So whether this is using a combat trick like Adamant Will to suddenly blank a removal spell or win combat, or whether it's casting Syncopate for an amount of mana that you can't pay for. These are the kinds of commons and uncommons that you need to be aware of. It sounds like a daunting task perhaps, but there aren't really that many. And you'll also find if you play limited enough, you'll just start to know, because these are all commons and uncommons you've seen a bunch of. But going into a format, it's a great idea to be aware of these things. because, you need to know, maybe I need to play around Syncopate and they only have 2 mana up, so I'll play something where I have more than 1 mana to pay in case they counter it, instead of playing into the Syncopate and getting it countered. You need to know I probably shouldn't block here or try to do something fancy here because Adamant Will could blow me out. And you just need to be aware of these things. And the more you are, the more prepared you'll be for if things go sideways, and you can just avoid things going really badly for you overall. And number 2, I have make sure you have a good mana base. This was almost number 1. In the end, I decided to bump it down, but this is something that I think I've seen a lot of people do. I think it's one of the things, of all the things on this list, that I think is hurting people the most, because I've seen way too many people play like a 6/6/6 mana base or a 6/6/5 mana base with 0 fixing. What I mean by that is 6 of one basic land, 6 of another, and 5 of another. And not running any Evolving Wilds, any source of fixing. And they're doing this because they want to be able to play their most powerful cards or whatever, right? They want to be able to play the best things that they drafted. And sometimes, I'm not saying you don't ever do this, because sometimes a draft really train wrecks, and your best chance is to make a horrible mana base like this and to pray that you don't get hurt by your mana. Because if you don't, you have a good shot, because the power level of your cards is high, perhaps. But for the most part, you shouldn't be doing that. It depends on the format, of course, but your average limited format, the best you're going to do is play 2 colors and splash 1. And what I mean by splash is you play like 1 Evolving Wilds and 1 basic land, or you have a couple of mana fixing creatures and then you run 1 basic land. That's usually the where you should be going with a mana base in your typical limited format. And the reason for this is mana bases in limited are already really bad. Like, compare them to constructed, where you can build these excellent mana bases thanks to all these dual lands. In limited, you're often finding yourself building like a 9/8 mana base or an 8/8 mana base, and it's not good. I mean, it's just not good. That mana screw is way more common in limited because of that. You're just sometimes not going to get a color, or you're never going to get double of a color, and this is just how it is. So when you throw a 3rd color in and cut a bunch of basics to add that 3rd color in, so you can add basics for those cards, you're ending up with a terrible mana base. And you should basically never be playing a mana base that is a 6/6/6. It's kind of funny that it's the number of the beast, but you shouldn't be doing it. That's one way to remember it, I guess. Again, sometimes you have to do it, but you should try to make a pretty good mana base that will limit how much mana screw happens to you. And this is very doable. I mean, playing a 2-color deck is usually, you're going to end up with a pretty good deck in limited if you drafted whatever was open. And if you're splashing a 3rd color for a great card or a couple of cards, you can often do that too, as long as you prioritize fixing a little bit. There are exceptions to all of this, of course. We talk about Kaldheim, you could play 4 and 5 color decks and stuff like that. But I would say, for the most part, build better mana bases. Don't trap yourself into a 3-color deck unless you absolutely have to. Pick a lane during the draft, figure out what's open, and stick with it once you have things sort of figured out. And you're going to end up with a deck that's probably better as a 2-color deck than whatever 3-color monstrosity you're going to try to make. And at number 1, I have a cliche, and that is practice makes perfect. I've already alluded to this some. You'll learn the instant spells that are at common and uncommon just from playing a format, ultimately. But in general, I think you'll find, both doing a lot of drafts and playing a lot of games with your draft decks is just probably the best way to improve. You'll gradually come to understand things in limited a little bit better, be able to understand what you should be valuing in the draft and what you shouldn't be, depending on the format in some cases. Each format is different, of course. And you should be able to improve, and you will consistently improve if you continue to practice. And an important thing here too is when things go sideways for you, to sort of critically try to figure out what it has happened. Sometimes the answer is just variance because it's magic, but oftentimes there's something you can figure out. Usually when my drafts don't go well, by the 2nd or 3rd loss, so near the end, I sort of figure out what I got wrong. Maybe I didn't have enough, in Crimson Vow, one of the things I found myself figuring out was just didn't have enough removal to answer bombs. I had cheap removal that could kill small things, but nothing to kill big things. And this is something that you often find is a problem. And for me, that was a big problem in this format. So yeah, you'll figure things out more the more you play. And, playing's fun. So, it's something you're going to want to do anyway, but it is something that will sort of gradually help you improve at limited magic. All right, so that's going to do it for today. Those are my 10 tips for success in any limited format. I hope you find them useful. We're not going to do a crack-a-pack today. Crimson Vow's near the end. We've done a bunch of them in this series already, and I don't think we need to do more of them to talk more about this format. By this point, it's a format that's been around for a while, so no crack-a-pack today. That's why this is the end of this video. If you enjoyed this video, you found the tips useful, or you think there's some things I'm wrong about, let me know in the comments, and also like it and share it so that others can enjoy it. If you want to make sure you catch future editions of Nizzanotes, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to make sure that you are all caught up on all episodes of Nizzanotes and my set reviews and my draft videos, you'll see some playlists for those things on your screen shortly. And lastly, if you want to go the extra mile in supporting the channel, you can on Patreon. Thanks for watching.